Week 16 is the first of 5 full weeks that we are reading in the book of Acts in the 2020 Bible reading plan in the New Testament. And one of the great things about the book of Acts is that it gives us a picture of the earliest Christians, the earliest church, and it sets a great standard and example for what it means to be a follower of Jesus and to serve him and work for him and to spread his message in the world. And so let's talk about what we can learn from chapters 3 to 7 when looking at this first church of Jesus' followers in Jerusalem at this point before it spreads in later chapters through Judea, Samaria, and as Luke says in chapter 1, to the ends of the earth. Okay, a few things we want to point out about the first church in Jerusalem in these chapters. The first is that they are bold. This section begins with what we saw in chapter 2, which is Peter and the other apostles standing in the temple complex and boldly proclaiming the message about Jesus to all those who have been attracted by the miracle they perform when they heal the lame man. And that leads to, in chapter 4, their arrest and standing trial before the Jewish authorities. And that happens again in chapter 5. But in both of those instances, the apostles, who we remember from the gospel stories, ran away and fled when Jesus was arrested. Now they stand boldly before these authorities and tell them in chapter 4 and 5, we will continue to speak what we have seen and heard because we must obey God rather than men. And then this section ends on a sad note with Stephen, who also boldly proclaims this message about how Jesus fulfills everything that has been spoken through the Hebrew scriptures. And now he, the Christ, is risen from the dead and sees him standing at the right hand of God. And this is too much for the authorities, who are cut by this message, but in a bad way. And they rush at him and they stone him. But his example, along with Peter and John and the other apostles, shows the boldness of these first Jesus followers in proclaiming the message of a crucified and risen Messiah. But with that, we see that the first church is also very prayerful. A couple instances to point out in this section. One is in chapter 4 when hearing about the threats being made to them by the authorities, the immediate response of the church is to get together and to pray. And they pray as one body and they lift their voice, asking God to hear their prayer and give them boldness. And that's exactly what happens. God answers their prayers and they can speak boldly from that point forward. But another instance we'll point out is in chapter 6, when there is a need in the church because some of the Hellenistic or Greek-speaking widows seem to be neglected in the daily contribution. The apostles say that they cannot be the main ones helping with this problem and that others need to be appointed because they need to spend time devoted to the Word of God and to prayer. And just let that sink in, how important prayer was to these apostles if they couldn't take on extra responsibilities because they were so deeply involved in the Word, ministering the Word, and in prayer. So these early Christians, this first church was a prayerful church. And we also see in this section, as we saw last week, that the Jerusalem church was generous. Again, in chapter 4, we get a description of how they had all things in common. They were sharing. They did not count their possessions as their own. Think about how different that is from a modern American materialistic mindset. Barnabas stands out as an example of this. And in chapter 5, the contrast is Ananias and Sapphira because they lie about how much they're giving to try to look better, and their lie is called out and they are struck down, dead, on the spot, which shows something about how serious this is in this new church to remove pride from oneself and to do everything from a heart of sincerity and generosity. And that's what we see in this early Jerusalem church. They're bold in proclaiming the gospel in spite of opposition. They are prayerful and leaning on the Lord to give them the strength that they need. And they are generous in supporting one another and giving selflessly out of their love for one another so that no one is lacking. And what an example that is for all of us to follow, who to seek to pattern ourselves after the model of these first New Testament Christians. So enjoy chapters 3 to 7 and see what you can learn about what it means to be a Christian in the world today.